Greetings, everybody. And I am really been looking forward to this interview for a long time. I am speaking with Lissa Mccullough, who is professor of philosophy, Cal State Dominguez Hills. Did I get that right?
Good.
And she is the author of this book, which I highly recommend, The Religious Philosophy of Simone Weil. As you've probably noticed, I post quite a few quotes and articles about Simone. So this is going to give us a chance to really unpack this. And so before we start, maybe just a little bit about yourself. Who is Lissa?
Oh, that's a less interesting topic, but I was born in Berkeley, California, and I was a faculty brat. My father was a graduate student when I was born, and later professor of philosophy at University of Michigan. So I spent many years in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Then eventually my father replaced his own advisor at University of California, Berkeley. And I ended up going to UC Santa Cruz for my bachelor degree. Became interested in those years in religious thought, particularly modern Christian thought, mainly through the figure of Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard grabbed me and fascinated me and drew me in, and this took me to a completely unexpected direction. I did not ever honor Christian ideas or religious ideas of any kind. So it was a huge turning point for me to discover Kierkegaard. And soon after that, I was in a used bookstore in Santa Cruz, and I saw a title. This was Logos Bookstore, a great bookstore in Santa Cruz. And I saw a title, Waiting for God. And I mean, I just it was like a magnet. I took the book. I already had this feeling. And indeed, I read a few paragraphs, bought the book, and ended up totally enthralled with Simone Weil as well as Kierkegaard. It was like both together. And so I resolved to go on and study religious thought in graduate school. I went to Harvard Divinity School for a 2-year master's program, completed that, and then ended up going to the University of Chicago for my PhD in systematic theology, with David Tracy as my advisor.
Wow. And
then I taught at a couple of colleges, at Hanover College in Indiana and at Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania. And then I made a radical decision to leave academia for many years. And I was looking for life, not for academia. Not to say that the two can't be combined. And I ended up just coming back to academia, teaching philosophy at this school presently. And very happy there. I really like the university and my students. And I find it very stimulating to be continually getting to the fundaments as you do in teaching. You really have to look at the fundaments of any thinker, any position, any book, to be able to teach it responsibly. And I really love that exercise. And I love this when students get excited by those fundamental ideas, as young people tend to do. They really are hungry for it, and so I enjoy the teaching a lot more than I did at first. When I ended up leaving academia, it was partly because I hadn't found my style or approach as a teacher, and maybe it was just that I needed more life experience before I could teach sincerely, something like that.
Was the religious philosophy of Simone Weil written in the intervening years in between academic stints?
It was actually my doctoral dissertation, and later revised, much later revised as a book. I kind of stuck it in the drawer, so to speak, the metaphorical desk drawer and left it there, knowing that I really wanted to publish it one day, but I was waiting for the right moment, where I felt that the time of my life was right to really come back and make it what I thought it could be. There were a lot of rough aspects to it as first written.
Well, thank you. Let's turn to Simone. Maybe introduce her to the audience. A little biographical sketch for those who don't know her.
She was born in 1909. She was one of two children born to a secular Jewish couple who lived in Paris, and Simone's elder brother is a famous 20th century mathematician. I mean, he's a very important mathematician. And she grew up in a way in his shadow for a couple of reasons. One, because he was so obviously brilliant. He was older by 2 years. He was obviously brilliant and able to shine being older. And she ended up in some ways in his shadow. Also, she was treated like a little girl, and she resented that, being he was the genius and she was the beauty, and she suffered from that, I think, quite a bit in her youth. But that partly helped make her who she was to be. It partly helped define Simone Weil to herself. I think that there's a certain way in which she chose very early to be the one who is nothing, who is a nobody. This is something that Emily Dickinson writes in one of her poems. I'm a nobody, are you a nobody too? And she accepted very young that we are all a nothing, a nobody. And you know, I think that her being in the shadow of her brother brought that to the fore early. She was also very responsive to human suffering very young. And clearly she was one of those exceptional people. I don't mean necessarily exceptional that they stand out as famous or genius, but exceptional in the sense that she's in that 5% of people who just are not conventional. They're just not gonna live a life like everybody else, whether because they're born with a deformity of some kind, or they're born with a talent, or they're born with, they're somehow an outsider. They lie on the fringe of what's conventional and typical. And she embraced that in her life, and she lived a life completely characterized by this individuality, this maverick personality. I'm sure she was difficult to be friends with, difficult to have as a daughter, but on the other hand, those who really understood her and appreciated her found her just an incredible presence in their lives, unforgettable and transformative friend to have. So you had to be capable of Simone Weil. You had to be capable of accepting the difficult side in order to get all that was so powerful about her. She lived a very short life. She died at age 34 in 1943. And it wasn't actually a violent death as it might have been, as it was for millions in that era during World War II. But she was, during the Vichy era, she was a refugee in the south of France from Paris with her parents. They sailed to the United States, and there she spent 6 months living in Harlem, living in New York City, or rather, yeah, I think roughly the Harlem neighborhood. And then she came back to Europe to live in London and work with the Free French movement, the French resistance movement there. And it was there that she was so ill with tuberculosis and malnutrition and seemingly some kind of spiritual ailment, of feeling that she had exhausted her options, and she basically died of exhaustion, malnutrition, tuberculosis, and frustration, it seems. Some people like to read her death as a kind of anorexic self-annihilation because she refused nutrition. But I tend to think that that's not the right word to use, not the right notion. Clearly, she lived with great force and commitment, and somehow she let herself die as part of that whole, the whole that was her life. And I just don't think we can easily judge it or know or specify what she died of.
Yeah.
That's sort of the biography in a quick round.
Yeah. So her vision of the human being, our dilemmas, are how we find ourselves thrown into the world.
Yes, we are thrown into the world. Of course, that's Heideggerian language. She doesn't actually use that language, but we are born into the world, and she understands the human being as a extremely limited, fragile, and conditional existent in a world that is constituted by force. The material world is a world in which, a realm in which forces interact and collide. And some of those forces are what bring us into being and allow us to exist. It's the sun on the soil and the water from the sky that allows us to exist because we need the plants for food. We breathe air that's a consequence of various forces at work. So our lives are completely conditional. We are conditioned beings. And what this means is there are very real limits to our power. We are radically vulnerable. Those conditions change suddenly and you're gone. You're destroyed. And this is an aspect of human existence that we tend to resist. We tend to lie to about ourselves. We don't want to accept the limits of our power. We don't want to accept that we are destined for death. We don't want to accept that we're going to come to an end. And all of our existence is, in a sense, to her, a lie. It's an illusion we create around ourselves, this illusion of power and ability, and even in the way as a species we pursue technologies and the power of technologies. It's all to fend off the simple fact of death, and the full reality of our limitations. We're always trying to defy those limitations and extend our power. And so she's interested in facing the reality of our conditional nature. And it's actually not a nature, it's a conditioned existence. Mm-hmm. And she's a realist through and through, if you ask me. I think some people would not agree. I think she's only interested in characterizing what she understands to be reality. And that includes religious realities that are not visible, and it includes material realities that are. And she wants to understand the relationship between them. And for her, the relationship is dialectical. I would say the way in which she has a religious turn in her late 20s. She's about 28 years old, and she begins to have a series of religious experiences that cause her to begin in her notebooks, which is where she's putting most of her thinking, a serious kind of experimental, exploratory thinking, is being recorded in notes in her notebooks. And she begins turning to religious language, language of God, language of the supernatural, language of the soul and its sin, the sinfulness of the soul. And all of this would have been foreign to the early Simone Weil, the Simone Weil who was writing very voluminously in her 20s and even her teens. She started writing early, and she just kept on writing and writing. It was almost as though she knew that her vocation was as a thinker who was taking on the primary problems of late modern existence with just an open mind, a brave and bold spirit, courage, and a set of ideas that she was working with, that she accepted as valuable. And so it began with a focus in her 20s, it began with a focus on labor. It was more a focus on what human beings do have the power to take into their own hands and do have the power to change about the world, you know, very Marxist in a way. She loved Marx for his analyses of what has happened historically and the socio-political realities. But she flawed Marx for his solutions to those problems. She thought that he was, in the end, kind of dreaming of some, you know, fantasy outcome where the proletariat would win the day one day. She didn't buy it. She thought that these very forces that he's analyzing are not so easily overcome. And indeed, if we look around the world today, we see a lot of those same forces still strangling life on Earth very actively, as strongly as ever before. And in that sense, we need Weil's early thinking more than ever before. But as she got into her late 20s, as I said, she made this turn to away from the question of what can we do with our small but real human powers to rearrange the social order, to fight the good fight politically, to ameliorate human suffering, to address the needs of the post-war and late modern era, all of those things. She wrote a long essay just before her death addressing what should France be doing after the defeat of Hitler. And she wants to hold her nation responsible for all of its failings before, during, and after the war, as a way of taking responsibility. She said, let us look ourselves in the mirror and see all that we've been doing wrong as a nation in order to start getting on the right track. And that book, in French, it's called L'enracinement, which means that it's translated in English, the need for roots. But what it really means is, in French, is rootedness, or enrootedness, enrooting yourself, l'enracinement. And so that's a book very important for our time. A lot of what she's analyzing there remains true. And that's more the public-spirited, socially engaged Simone Weil. Still at the end of her life, you see that. But the religious thinker, which is not, of course, not unrelated, she's wholly all of this makes sense together, but when you really go deeply into the religious thinking, it's almost like another domain, where her concern is not any longer with human powers and how we can ameliorate the evils of the social order and the evils of politics and so on. And she's beginning to ask, what is the responsibility of the individual soul in this world of the radical poverty of the creature? Because in a very deep sense, despite all her concern for the social and the political, which was very strong, finally she felt the only way to take responsibility is individual. The only way to find truth is individual. She makes the point at one point that you know, two people can't add 2 + 2. It's the one person or the other or both who add 2 + 2 as their intellectual faculty is able to do that. And often you try to ask a group to add 2 + 2, you're never going to get there. If you've ever had a committee meeting to try to accomplish something, you'll know what I mean. So she's saying that the individual faculty of thought is the bastion of freedom, of truth, and of judgment of value. And we can't count on groups. We can't count on the social beast. She calls it the social aspect, the great beast, because it's so reliably goes wrong. It so reliably goes in the wrong direction and does bad things and does not understand. And so we need the individual to understand, to seek the truth. And so as she's trying to understand the role of the individual in the most ultimate sense, she becomes a religious thinker. The role of the individual is to take responsibility for their place in the cosmos. And a huge part of that is understanding what is the nature of reality? What is this world that I'm in? What does it mean? How do I read it? And so she really understands this hermeneutic operation. The religious turn is a hermeneutic operation to understand the nature of the cosmos, the nature of human existence, to face it, to accept it, to live in accord with it. And that's when she turns to an understanding of God. Now, it's a very non-traditional, unorthodox understanding of God in many ways, in many respects. I mean, if you take her theology and put it side by side with most traditional Christian theologies, there are several points at which you would have to say that she's a heretic. She's heretical, she's, let's say, unorthodox. For example, that we are born in sin. Not just that we're born in sin the way Augustine speaks of us being born with original sin, but that we are actually created sinful, that God created us sinful. That's an unorthodox, let's say, heretical position. And she doesn't mind that. It doesn't bother her to be rethinking the dogmas or doctrines of the church and giving them a new spin. She thinks that the church has gone wrong in so many respects itself that there's a duty to rethink what is our relationship to the dogmas of the church, to the doctrines of the church. What is the right relationship with these teachings and these powerful mysteries, she calls them, And it's our duty to take them up and think for ourselves and not just bow down to whatever the church happens to say about them. So that's another way in which she has a quasi-Protestant character as a religious thinker. There are many moments in which she sounds like Luther, or many of the late medieval thinkers, like Meister Eckhart, or the author of the Theologia Germanica, the German. Luther published it, but it's written long before him. It's an anonymous author of the Theologia Germanica. Very powerful text. Simone Weil sounds like she's lifting some of her ideas out of that text, which was very influential on Luther. But my explanation in the book for why she sounds so Protestant is that she's actually Jansenist. Right. And the last chapter of the book is talking about Jansenism as the background to her religious ideas, because they're very dialectical in the way that Luther's ideas are dialectical. And of course, Luther's whole background in late medieval nominalism and the rise of a God who is a kind of an unknown God, a looming chaos, not chaos, but abyss, a looming abyss, a God who's unknowable for Luther except through Christ. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's Luther building on a tradition already going back a couple of centuries. And so it's not like he invented it, but he's the one who brought it into the world of, early modern Europe and made it a doctrine accepted by millions. And then, of course, the Reformation took those ideas to new places. So Simone Weil, in many ways, sounds like a reformed Protestant thinker. But the way I understand that is that she's absorbing these ideas in their Catholic form from thinkers like Pascal. And there's even a way in which Descartes reflects this tradition. And the whole Jansenist background Paris was one of the hot spots for that whole line of theologies and again, it's within traditional French Catholicism, it's a heretical tendency. Mm-hmm. A neo-Augustinian, dangerously flirting with heresies.
Mm-hmm. So she takes a Cartesian dualism, if you will, and it becomes dialogical. So there's this thought and extension, mind, body, and I'm assuming that what little freedom human beings have, I mean, you talk about it in terms of consent.
She does, yes.
But it's also, I would imagine, it has something to do with the capacity of thinking. And this is part of this larger project of thinking our place in the world.
Yes, absolutely. We're this tiny speck in the universe, but we have this power of thought that's universal. So in a way, we are, despite our weakness, in a world of external forces, just as you said, the extensio of Descartes, this world governed by laws of force and push and shove and movement, and despite their vulnerability as conditioned beings within those forces, we have this infinite universal power of thought. And that's what we need to use to take responsibility, to understand the forces of the world, to understand our place in the universe, and then to live rightly based on that depth of understanding. And to basically make our understanding universal when we have a strong tendency, what she means by original sin, her version of it, it's not Augustine's version. It's not that Adam and Eve were created sinless and basically perfect, and then there was a fall, and original sin was like a botching of the original plan. She actually sees God creates us sinful. It creates us with a inverted understanding of things. And we have to go through a conversion, she says, that puts us back in right order with the way things are. And what that ends up meaning is we basically have a choice between power and love. Mm. And your response to being a vulnerable creature characterized by an absolute poverty, your response to that can be to grab all the power you can get. And that is the response a lot of people have. Like, you know, the Hobbesian view that life is just a quest for power after power. You see that in the world around you in various forms: financial, economic, political. You saw that in her era with the rise of Hitler, you know, this kind of quest for power after power. Stalin, and so on. And obviously for they, that's the wrong response. That's the response that's taking the sinful outlook, which is to seek power, to become like God in the sense of God's power. Mm. That's just expanding the sin to blot out the world. It's absolutely nihilistic and destructive. So the proper response is to invert that, and instead of seeking power, to seek love. And what you do is actually reduce, you come to understand that you have no power, literally no power, and to reduce your demand for power, your desire for power, to renounce power, to renounce, she uses words like abdication. And her big term for this is decreation. When we elect and consent to decreate ourselves, what we're doing is renouncing that little bit of power that we actually have, and saying, in order to see justly, in order to have a universal view, I'm renouncing my claim on life, and I'm going to take a God's eye view, which is a universal view, seeing all things in their true relations, without inserting myself and my needs into that vision. I'm taking myself out of the equation. I'm making myself nothing in order to be, she says, equal to God. Now, how is it that God is equal to nothing? Well, she asserts that again and again in her religious thought. What does that mean? She speaks of the void. And this is one of the most powerful concepts in her work. It's very distinctive of her thought, the way she uses this term. It's much more a question of a spiritual void, not a material void here. We're not talking about a vacuum in nature. We're talking about a spiritual void. And the power of this is to say, when I reach out and try to assert my power in the world, where it reaches a limit, the void begins. For me, I experience everything that manifests the limits of my power and the conditioned nature of my being. I experience that as void. Some examples, you know, you apply for a promotion and you don't get it. You feel void. You seek to marry someone and they are not interested in you. You feel void. You You wanted badly to achieve some personal goal and you fail miserably at it. Void. A loved one dies. You feel void. And the void is what we experience at the limits of our power every time. Even when we experience hunger, you could say you're hungry for lunch and you just ate a few hours ago, but you feel the void. You feel the threat, the limit of your being. If I don't eat something, you know, I'm going to be going hungry. And she believes that we have this very poor capacity to accept our existence as a hunger for reality, a hunger for completion. And we have a difficulty because we have hands and because we have certain physical powers and mental powers, we want to use those, like through our technologies, to grab the world and empower ourselves. But she believes that the spiritual response is to diminish your power and to, in a sense, go quiescent and ask for illumination from what she calls the supernatural. Now, we use the word supernatural to refer to all kinds of things in outer space, aliens with special powers. And so she doesn't mean supernatural in that sense. She simply means by supernatural, above the natural. So it's something outside the natural world. So again, the extensio of Descartes as a concept helps. You know, it's the world around about us that we experience through our bodies. That's the natural world. It's the world of forces that rise and fall. Mountains are born, mountains wash away, and so on. The Earth, planet Earth is born, planet Earth goes into destruction, and so on. You know, with enough time, everything under the sun and beyond comes to an end. These are the forces at work in the actual cosmos. And so this is the Cartesian extensio, this realm of forces and powers that balance each other finally. And she calls this the realm of necessity. What's distinctive about necessity? That the good is absent from necessity. The absolute good. Now, there are relative goods, you know, the way that nature has arranged itself. You suddenly see that flowering tree and you're just absolutely struck with the beauty of existence. And that's one of the graces that is that in this realm of force, where everything is conditional, there is nonetheless beauty. There is the moments, for one person, one set, for another person, another set, but we experience moments of beauty. And we long for our existence to be totally fulfilled with that, to be absolutely beautiful. But what we come up against is a world of misery and suffering and torture and death and genocide, and we don't have any power to make the world other than that. We have a very limited power to act, and it's our duty to act to the extent we have the power to make the world more just, to the extent we have that power to save a soul, to give a piece of bread to a starving person. It's our duty if we feel it as a duty. But there's a real limit to how much we can change the world to suit our longing for the good, because the world is constituted by necessity. And this is where her theory of creation is very unorthodox also. There's the traditional notion, say, by someone like Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, that God creates the world out of his power, that God wills the world into existence. He makes a decision to create the world, and does this out of his power as an omnipotent creator. That's the traditional view in Christianity and in Judaism and in Islam. They sees the creation by God in very different terms, in more dialectical terms, that God, to create the world, had to withdraw himself and allow a realm to exist that's other than God. And not only other than God, but void of God. You know, imagine something. You've got God who's like all things, a total plenitude of being, nothing lacking. So when God withdraws that plenitude of himself to create the world, he's creating a space of void. And the way Simone Weil characterizes the creation, it's God shackling himself, tying his hands behind his back and limiting his powers in order that something other than himself can exist. And that's the world that suffers the reign of necessity, where necessity reigns instead of the good. If good reigned in our world, we wouldn't exist because everything would be so fulfilled. We'd be right back to God again. We would be God. There would be nothing but God. God had to withdraw, create a realm of void, fill that realm with conditioned necessity for any creatures to exist.
And yet we can find places where this thinking obtains with other folks. Isaac Luria,
yes,
or the kenosis.
Right.
And even some, I would say, some panentheistic thinkers who are emphasizing love. But do we know where? One of the things I love about your book is you take on all the people that speculate that this is this and this is that, this is Gnostic, so on. Do we have a sense of how she came to that sense of God emptying himself and this realm being one of void?
Not really. I mean, we can't pinpoint it. Many people have studied the question. I haven't focused on studying this question per se, so I'm kind of trusting those scholars. I've read what I could get my hands on about where this notion came from, how she came across it, or how she came to it. And I don't think that we can say that she read Luria. Had she heard of Luria? Well, she doesn't mention him, I don't think. I could even be mistaken about that, but I don't think that she mentions him anywhere in her work. Don't quote me on that. And of course, she read Schelling, who in many ways reflects this tradition of the self-necessitation of God, as a counterpoint to his goodness. So some people point to Schelling, some people point to Luria, or they may have been just an exposure to the general idea in conversations with others, you know, these highly educated people that she was surrounded with during her school years and after. We don't really know. But certainly it does resemble Luria's theory very closely. And of course, she was Jewish in background. She was in many ways anti-Jewish, and in ways that are, you know, potentially very offensive. If you take offense, it's offensive. If you try to see her inner context and say, well, her anti-Judaism really was symptomatic of her intellectual class and strata in France at the time. Everybody was anti-Jewish. Everybody was anti-Semitic to a degree in France at that time. And some people see her as defensive about her Judaism or her Jewish background. I don't really go there and speculate about it very much. I want to face up to the extent to which she was anti-Jewish and not cover that over by any means and see it as a blind spot, that she really sought to understand other religious traditions with great attraction to them, with great attention to them. But she had a blind spot with Judaism, that she wouldn't tolerate it. She wouldn't listen to it. She wouldn't recognize that it's a living tradition in her own day, that it's not something that it's not just biblical text. Right. She would go to the Bible and read biblical texts, and those that she loved, she tended to attribute to something, some other people, like right. Job must be an old Egyptian tale, or everything she loved about the Hebrew scriptures, she tended to attribute to earlier peoples or Near Eastern traditions or something other than the Jews. And then everything negative about the Hebrew Bible, she blamed the Jews, castigated them for. And I think it's really incredibly unfair, given that her extremely, searching moral standards, her standards for being purely moral are certainly a heritage of Judaism, of the Jewish teachings, of the teachings of the prophets, and there's such powerful witness in that tradition that was then taken up into Christianity, much of it, which is where she gets it. And then she calls it Christian, not Jewish. Is that fair? Is that fair? How much Christianity would we have without Judaism?
Right.
If any. And she doesn't do justice to that strong root structure that made Christianity possible, including, of course, Jesus and Paul. And so much of early Christianity is just directly a flowering of Judaism. She was in denial about that. She was a sort of Marcionite.
Yeah.
Where she wanted to purify the Bible of Jewishness. To me, it's just nonsense. She was deeply mistaken about all of this. But and it was largely because she didn't have actively Jewish religious friends. And she didn't have exposure to those traditions, and she was just basically picking up the atmosphere of her time. It was just in the air to see things this way, unless you yourself were Jewish. And so she didn't. This was a case where she didn't rise above her time. In most other cases, she did.
Yeah. So just getting back to this. Taking a little more psychological turn, that human beings cannot accept their limited nature. And she talks about, rather than do that, we have a decided preference for what she calls the imagination, which I sometimes think that's a little unfortunate. I would rather she had used the term fantasy, but either or. And therefore, in order to overcome our propensity for imagining, we need to cultivate attention. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great central concept of her thinking too. I'm glad you bring it up. You're right about imagination. She sometimes uses the term very negatively, and sometimes very positively. And you have to recognize, in the one case, she's talking about illusion, letting your imagination create illusions. And she uses the word illusion a lot. So that's definitely one of the ways in which we try to take power and assert ourselves, is through creating a ersatz reality. She says, ersatz meaning false, phony. We create around ourselves the phony reality because we are defending ourselves, protecting ourselves from the reality that causes us suffering. And in the most extreme form, causes us affliction. Affliction is her very strong word for the most severe forms of suffering, which would, one paradigm of that would be Jesus on the cross, crying out to God in absolute abject affliction. The word in French is malheur, absolute, sort of a kind of like being swallowed up in evil is the notion of being swallowed up with no remaining resource, completely in the hands of evil. That's the way to think about affliction. Delivered to evil, delivered into the hands of evil. So what is the role of attention here? We are always subject or potentially subject to this deliverance into evil. Even the Lord's Prayer prays to be delivered from that power over us that's always waiting in the wings. The wolf is always at the door. And it's true of every single living creature, human and non-human. The wolf is at the door at all times. This small speck of reality that we are can be snuffed out. We are powerless. And so our imaginative powers are used to create an ersatz reality. And it's only when that ersatz reality itself disappoints us rudely that we suddenly are thrust into the void. We understand our powerlessness. And we have a choice then to either face the truth and start paying attention to the way things really are, or to try to create more illusions to fill the gap, wilder and wilder illusions. They say that Hitler toward the end was having these megalomaniac, like he was just off the deep end. Why? Because he had nothing left. Yeah. So it was like either off the deep end or suddenly draw back and face the reality that really is real. And, many choose the megalomaniac path because it's less painful than facing reality. So the role of attention is to deliver reality to us by our own free will. To pay attention takes an enormous amount of spiritual energy, not so much physical energy, like say, we're running a machine and we're tired, we're riding a bicycle. And we're tired and we're running out of physical energy. We've been riding for hours. We need a break. That's one form of energy. It's the physical energy. But she thinks that there's a spiritual energy that's a different ball game. And spiritual energy actually, when it's functioning with great spiritual power, it's almost infinite. At the highest level, spiritual energy is like a food for us. And to the extent that we are able to sustain this energy and pay attention to things, their actual reality, the way they truly are, not the way we would fantasize them to be, the world as it really is delivered to us. We understand necessity. We understand that we're nothing. We understand a virtual death of ourselves because we are as good as dead. Life is a lie, only death is true, she writes. Now that's an extreme statement, but she wants you to feel it. It's an existential statement. Because in 50 years or 100 years, it is going to be true, whatever your age right now. Death will be true. And she believes that to the extent that we can see the world as it truly is, we can be just. We can be, our view of things can be undistorted. And even more important, we can start playing the role of a kind of God on earth, a Christ likeness, okay? So God, the limitation of God is when God creates the world, his hands are tied. He can't intervene. What happens if he intervenes? creaturely life is evaporated like water on a stone, she says. So God loves, she says, as an emerald is green. God's consistency is that he stays, he sends rain on the just and the unjust alike. This is not a moral universe. This is a universe consistently maintained by necessity, but the good is absent. The good is God. God is absent. God does not exist. If you start talking about God as existing, you're really messing it up. You don't understand anything from Simone Weil's point of view. This is, again, what's really, unorthodox, you could say heretical, that it's not possible to affirm God's existence, but it is possible to affirm God's absence. And it's God's absence from the world that allows the world to exist, that allows the creature to exist. And we are in this world, part of this world, able to understand that, understand why God withdrew, why the world is under the reign of necessity, that ultimately all of this is an act of love by God, that we exist. Now, it's not about us, actually. If you read her theology carefully, we can understand ourselves as part of this drama, but it's actually God's own drama, that God, being perfect, being a superabundant reality in himself, had to manifest his love. He couldn't just be himself eternally and be satisfied with this superabundance. And this is also an idea in Meister Eckhart, that this superabundance had to overflow. It had to manifest itself by giving itself to another. That's why the creation of the world. Now, that's often found in traditional theology, this notion of God's superabundance pouring out and creating the world. But she understands that pouring out as a holding back, not that a certain amount of God's goodness pours into that space. No, God actually has to withhold his goodness, create a space of absence, of void, in order for something other than God to be, in order to give himself to that. So how does she look at the world? The world is that place in the reign of the void, in the realm of void, where God is manifesting his love through his absence. And she understands this as something God had to do because he's love. He had to manifest himself, she writes, across an infinite distance, which is very like a Kierkegaardian notion of the absolute qualitative distinction between God and the world. Very similar notion there, that God had to travel an infinite distance. And how does he do that? He crucifies himself. And that's where the suffering comes in, that God himself goes into the void as his son, enters into the void as a creature who elects to do the will of God perfectly on earth, to be that other that allows the love to cross an infinite distance and be real, be a real manifestation. It's not a fantasy. It's not something that never happened. It's something that's really manifest in history, in time, that God becomes crucified, self-crucified. And so the drama between father and son is one of absolute negation, in a sense. So it's in Christ, God undergoes his own absolute negation. And that self-negation is a process that's always there. This is where he's different from some death of God thinkers who think of there's a certain annihilation of God that happens, and then God is maybe transformed into something else. But Simone Weil's not thinking the death of God and then a change to some new reality. She's thinking this crucifixion of God is ongoing always. As long as there is time, this crucifixion is going on, and the world is the cross. And so what can we do? We can become Christ-like. When there's a starving person, God can't reach down and give that person bread, but we have the power to do that. We can. So we can act as God's lieutenant on earth, so to speak, taking the place of God and acting with divine, with supernatural love, if we get out of the way. So we have to get our own illusions and falseness and lust for power. We have to clear all of that out, become nothing, in order to be able to reflect supernatural love in the world. We understand the truth of things. We're able to understand that God, this absence, this suffering, this void is actually the love of God that we're feeling. And then we can refract that and express that love to others who are suffering by being that hand of God in the moment that God the Father cannot be.
It's one of the most arresting things when she talks about traversing these infinite distances, as she says, beauty is indicative of that there's something from the supernatural realm that makes it all the way here, but also that in extreme affliction, some people can still love and receive love. Not all, some are destroyed by affliction. And it seems that that is something that was a lived experience for her. And I also think that that point is perhaps more than anything that we've talked about, the most relevant to a recovery community, because either they're desperately in need of that experience, or they've had it. It's very hard to talk about, but you know, my own self, I had an experience where I'd lost everything. I'm in heroin withdrawal. I lost everything that I thought anyone might love me for. And that's, I think, the realm of something like imagination. Yeah. And yet some sort of love came into my life through another human being, actually, despite all that. Yes. Can you speak to that a little bit? I know that that's a hell of a question.
It's a great question. I mean, this is, for Wei, this is the real core. This is getting to the real deal. Let me just read a passage in which she describes affliction, you know, the furthest extreme of suffering. And human thought, this is Wei, human thought is unable to acknowledge the reality of affliction. To acknowledge the reality of affliction means saying to oneself, I may lose at any moment through the play of circumstance over which I have no control, through the anything whatsoever that I possess, including those things that are so intimately mine that I consider them as being myself. There is nothing that I might not lose. It could happen at any moment that what I am might be abolished and replaced by anything whatsoever of the filthiest and most contemptible sort. And I think when you hit bottom, you're that filthiest, contemptible being that's still there. And that's the void. That's the crucifixion. That's the absence of God. But the funny thing is about Vey, that very absence is the presence of God in the negative. And she says, hold on in that dark night. And you will find, if you only understand, this is the hand of God's love. This negation is the hand of God's love in which you are resting right now. Your whole existence is being sustained in that void. And it doesn't matter that loss. You can recover from that. That loss is just the truth of things. It's the truth of the universe. It's the truth of God. And that God chose that for himself. That's the message is finally, God chose the cross. You know, we're not joking there. You know, the most extreme, horrendous, abominable form of suffering, chose for himself, elected the cross as a way of manifesting his love and traveling the furthest distance. And what that means in Vey's theology is there's no void, there's no negative that you can go that God isn't there, that isn't God's reality. You're in God's bosom when you're in that void. That's her teaching. And, you know, it's a tough one. It's a stark one. But if you can feel it, and if it's real to you, it's incredibly salvific. It's so, makes you whole. Suddenly, in all that emptiness, it makes you whole. Because there's nothing, what happens in the void is you have the fullness of God, but in the negative. That doesn't mean it's not the fullness of God. Because it's precisely that fullness of God that God elected specially to see to that his self-denial went to that point of voiding himself.
Right.
And so when we go to God, she says, we have to go to the God who crucified himself. We don't go to the God in power. We don't go to the God who's superabundance. We go to the God who's on the cross. And that's what Luther says too, actually, which is so interesting. His Theologia Crucis is theology of the cross. It's saying, don't look to become like God in his power. You have to look to the cross and become like God in his suffering and God in his nakedness and his poverty.
I can see why she's such a challenge, because in the same constellation of ideas, she sounds so much like St. John of the Cross and the Carmelites.
Yes, and she loved St. John, yes.
God's absence is his mode of presence.
Yeah.
So it seems, now you're in a much better position to comment on this than I am, but it seems that this kind of theological nihilism, if you will, I don't know what to call it, has a certain currency right now because of people like Zizek or his reading of Chesterton or Peter Rollins or people like that. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Yeah. So that seems like that's a big opening to have dialogue with all manner of thinkers and disciplines.
Yes.
Do you feel that Simone is beginning to make it? I mean, my reading of her, so I got acquainted with her in my 20s, and I certainly was not equipped with this. And I've been kind of walking with her off and on for 30 years. And I only noticed at a certain point that there was the secondary literature in English, which I read a lot of. But I felt like, it's like the world had to catch up to her or something. That she literally, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it still hasn't. I think there is more and more literature being published. But the problem is, I think with the Simone Weil is, if she's just taken up in an academic style, there's a certain falsification that goes on. And you can't just treat her like another academic topic, like, you know, I did Hegel, and then I did, you know, and then I did Simone Weil, you know, it's just, you have to really be ready to write in a non-academic style, I think, too, because she, for all that, you know, it's intellectually, you know, her rich educational background is always visible, and her reading and her conversations with others, you know, you can really feel that she was, you know, capable of academics, but she was not looking to the academic world to understand her. She was really looking for, it's an existential calling to read her. And the problem is that academics tend to, you know, read the paper at the conference and then go off and have a drink, and there's not, like, has anybody suffered for this?
Yeah.
Has anybody really paid the price to, so Vape to me really much more belongs to a recovery community than it does to the academic world. A recovery community is much more likely to get her and get the benefit than the academic world. And I don't know if my leaving the academic world was partly connected with this, maybe, but I just think there are real limits to it, because the reason for pursuing the writing, the reading and writing and publishing is somewhat compromised. You know, publish or perish, and, you know, why are you doing this? Is it to do justice to Simone Weil? Is it to get the deepest level of benefit from Simone Weil? Or is it just another thinker to pick up because she's under-recognized and less explored and might make a good topic for an article or dissertation or book? And, you know, I think that makes all the difference in how she's written about, in how much is really on the mark in discussions of her work.
Well, she certainly demands something of you. I mean, in 30 years, or I don't, it's even longer than that now, this is the most intense conversation I've ever had about Simone Weil. I've had little scraps and this and that, but I didn't even realize that until this moment. So you're not going to, there's no superficial relationship. There's either a deep relationship or no relationship with her.
I think that's very well said. Yeah.
And I guess what I would ask you, at the risk of getting a little personal, is what did it do to you to take this on, I would imagine at a relatively young age, and just, you know, I'm assuming you did this with David Tracy?
Yes, David Tracy was my advisor, and I'm very grateful for his degree of involvement. But frankly, he let me, I wanted to do this on my own and just write it and have him read it and approve it. And that's basically what happened. I mean, I didn't work with him. You know, he was a very busy person, first of all, deeply in demand. And, but every moment when I really needed good feedback from him, he was there and he gave excellent feedback. So I really appreciated him as an advisor, but it wasn't this hand holding thing or getting feedback on drafts. No, I just wrote it, gave it to him. He said, great. And that was Except early on when I was working on the dissertation proposal, that's when he was incredibly important. He intervened on what would have probably taken 10 years to do. And he said, if I suggest you carve this way down and just do one small piece of it. And then, you know, think in terms of other books and other projects in the future to work this out, because what you have here, it's a 10-year project. And he was so right. You know, when you're young and you don't have experience with writing a first book, that was superb advice. It was a crucial intervention for me. It saved me a lot of probably, I might have never finished my PhD program. I might never have moved on. I would still be haunting the halls of the University of Chicago, a shadow of my former self. I don't know.
But what did it do to you? How did it leave you? Or
it only helped me. Nothing for me was difficult about reading Simone Weil. It was only salvific. I would say it was only a balm, because for me, she helped to bring an order. She says in her L'Enracinement, the Need for Roots, that book, which is a very late, this is actually her last long writing. She in the beginning of that, she talks about the fundamental needs of the human soul. And one of those fundamental needs is a need for order. It's actually the first one. A need for order. We cannot function without putting things to some degree in order. And that includes an architecture of the soul, an architecture of the intellect. And even if you can take it, you can say it's continually in construction, it's continually changing, fine, but you need order, you need, it's a logic, it's a structure. She helped me structure things so that I could make sense of, you know, the sufferings of existence and all that's very difficult to accept when you're young. And I was always with her against illusion. I don't want to suffer illusions. I just want to, if it's a hard and stark truth of things, I want that rather than illusion. And that's not to say that we don't all, she thought she herself suffers certain illusions. She actually doesn't believe we can fully escape illusion. But to be responsible and live responsibly, we have to fight it as best we can and not have, you know, great layers upon layers of illusion that we're living in, because then we're, you know, another need of the human soul is reality. Just as we need order, we also need reality. When we love something, we need it to be real and not an illusion. Partly because if it bursts, we're left with nothing. You know, illusions burst. You know, sooner or later, that illusion's going to come crashing down. If it's an illusion about yourself and your own powers, or you're suave and sophisticated, and then the truth comes out, you realize, I'm such a loser. You know, in a way, she has a very comforting message. It doesn't matter that you're a loser. You're loved by God. It doesn't matter, you know, being a loser, that's a social judgment. You don't need that. The social judgments are evil. That's so saving. You know, her negative view of sociality is so helpful to me, because it's a little bit like the way Thoreau can help you, like, put aside public opinion. Yeah. Who cares? Who cares what people think? What do you think? And as long as you're striving not to be deluded, not to have illusions, striving for some kind of pure understanding of the good and evil, at least you're on the path. Most of society, it's not on that path at all. And it needs it. It would benefit from it. And you can try to bring it to society, but it's always only the individual who's going to see that truth and try to bring it to society and kickstart that amelioration that hopefully sometimes happens. But in the end, society's the great beast, and it's just full of this sense. Let me read another quick passage here about society. I hope I marked it. She writes about sin and the prestige of force. Owing to the fact that the whole soul has not managed to know and accept human misery, we think there must be a difference between human beings. And consequently, we fail to be just, either by drawing a distinction between our advantage and that of other people, or else by marking a preference for certain individuals from among other people. This comes from the fact that we do not know that human misery represents a constant and irreducible quantity and exists in each man or woman in the largest possible form, and that greatness comes from a one and only God, so that every man is identical with every other man. Okay, so she sees a radical equality of all. Why? Because we're all equally marked by this absolute poverty. All equally. We're all bound for death. We're all potentially any moment subject to this affliction and suffering and annihilation. And that makes us radically equal. And at one point, she also writes about her jealous, she was jealous of her older brother, who always seemed to have this intellectual power she felt that she lacked. And later in life, she wrote about intelligence as someone of great intelligence. It's like the difference between having a large or a small prison cell. It doesn't matter that you're charming, that you're good looking, that you're super intelligent, that you're a genius, that you're a homeless person on the street, that you're a recovering addict. What does it matter? You have the same place in the universe as everybody else. You're a little piece of God, and you have the honor of being part of God's crucifixion, part of his decision to love, absolutely, and without any reservation of himself. And that drama is what is the stuff of your existence. And if you can feel that, she does see salvation as the ultimate vocation of the soul, that the salvation comes more likely in the void than in a time of plenitude, when you're full of yourself, when you're full of your powers.
Well, this has been fantastic.
That's Bay.
Well, you're mediating, Bay. And I think it'll be much appreciated by our audience.
Great.
So
I'd like to say hello to everyone and wish you the best in these tough times with the pandemic on top of everything that was already so difficult about life in the United States. You know, we need compassion more than ever today. We need empathy. We need the powers that Simone Weil's thinking is trying to absolutely maximize, which is this sense of the radical equality of all souls, the power of God in the void, the power of salvation in the void, and the absolute utter beauty of compassion, that this is what we exist for. And probably the best way to see your own value is to show and experience that compassion toward others. I mean, you will feel your power as soon as you're able to show compassion to others. It will manifest to you that you have this power of God to give love, give an absolute love and a perfectly pure love to others. And that is your real power as a creature, nothing else, not a career, not a worldly success, because that's empty. It's not filling the void. It's more stuffing in the void. You know, that people feel superior to other people because they have. The other night, I was eating in a restaurant, a post-COVID, situation, eating in a restaurant, and a couple drove up in a McLaren, a McLaren automobile. That's a $250,000 automobile. When they open the car doors, they go up like wings, and they step out and they pay in the parking meter like everybody else. Just some quarters on you. Yeah. It's pretty bizarre. But I'm thinking, you drive a McLaren. What does that say about you? What does that say about you? I don't know. I see a rolling insecurity complex. I don't know what other people see. But why did he think that was worth having as his car, he and she together? Because we like to believe there are real differences between human beings, and that some are inherently superior, or they earned a superiority, or they're just of a worthier sort. And, so many societies through history have been this way. The caste system, the, aristocratic versus commoner system. We had our own caste system until very recently, actually, in the Western world, the aristocratic and the common class. That's still maintained in England. Mm-hmm. And, we want to believe this because there's an illusion of being something rather than nothing that comes from that. For the lucky ones, it's very Calvinistic. Yeah. In Calvinism, you earn your salvation by buying a McLaren. Showing you have that money, you're blessed by God with the money to buy that McLaren. That makes you something, really something rather than nothing. And you have to manifest that to others so they know it too. And I just think from the point of view of Simone Weil, man, that's a loser. You just don't understand the first thing about human existence. So I've always found it easy to embrace Weil because it just takes care of so many social, political issues that I think are a waste of energy. Finally, you have to cut to the quick and get rid of all of that superstructure of the human perceptions, human judgments, human illusions, and get to the rock bottom realities of things. And she's so helpful with that. So if you're starting at the rock bottom, you don't have any illusions.
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Piers. And blessings to all.
Yes. Yes.
Show compassion to yourself first, and then to others. Nothing is more absolutely essential in this world.
We will be in touch.
Good.